Hi folks, welcome to another story time of the medieval era. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to find a comfortable spot, perhaps with a warm drink by your side. Allow the noise of the day to drift quietly into the background. Let your mind open to a journey, one that will gently carry us back through the centuries into a world very different from our own, yet hauntingly familiar in its fears, its fragile hopes, and the shadows that loomed just beyond sight. Our story today begins with a gentle breath of wind across the fields of medieval Europe. It begins in a time of teeming markets and humming villages, where peasants bent under the weight of their tools, and where narrow roads wound through forests echoing with birdsong. It begins, too, under the watchful eyes of lords in stone keeps, of priests intoning Latin chants beneath stained glass, of merchants haggling over bolts of silk that smelled faintly of faraway spice. Picture, if you will, the early decades of the 14th century. Europe is a patchwork quilt of kingdoms, duchies, bishoprics, and tiny principalities. Fields of barley and wheat ripple beneath the sun, dotted by grazing sheep and oxen straining at heavy ploughs. Here, life is defined by feudal bonds. Most people are serfs, men, women, and children tied by birth to the land of a lord. Their world is painfully small, stretching no farther than a neighboring village, or the distant outline of the manor house, where stone walls promise protection, but also demand tribute. Serfs rise before dawn, their bodies stiff from sleep on straw pallets. They trudge into fields damp with dew, hands cracked and calloused by endless labor. Their days are governed by the seasons and by obligation. Corvée labor, where they must toil on the Lord's domainy lands, repairing roads or harvesting grain, not for themselves, but for their master's stores. Tithes to the church, a tenth of whatever meager crop they pull from the stubborn soil. Rents and fees to their lord, paid not only in coin, scarce though it is, but in chickens, eggs, wheels of pungent cheese. The law grants them little protection. They cannot leave without permission, lest they be hunted down as fugitives. Marriages may require the Lord's blessing. Disputes are settled under his stern eye, and hope for a different life is a faint, wistful candle that flickers out long before it can ever catch fire. Yet even in this constrained existence, the rhythms of feast days and village fairs offer moments of laughter. Children chase hoops through muddy lanes, women gather to spin wool and share stories, and bells toll from distant steeples, calling the faithful to prayer. Beyond these narrow horizons lies a world bustling with energy. The Silk Road, a vast artery of commerce, stretches from the ports of the Mediterranean, across sun-scorched steppes, through teeming Persian bazaars, up over the rugged passes of the Pamirs, all the way to the elegant courts of China. Caravans laden with silks dyed in shades of crimson and jade, with porcelain clinking delicately in padded crates, and with bundles of aromatic spices, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, wind slowly through the deserts, each laden camel a humped silhouette against a burning sky. In the east, under the Yuan dynasty, China is a land of immense cities. Hangzhou and Kanbalik, modern-day Beijing, buzz with scholars and merchants from across the known world. Paper money changes hands. Astronomers plot the dance of the planets. Poets compose delicate verses about falling plum blossoms. Across the seas, the Islamic empires thrive, with Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus centers of learning and trade. Libraries overflow with manuscripts. Merchants tally accounts under intricately carved archways. While in West Africa, the Mali Empire, under rulers like Mansa Musa, gleams with the wealth of gold and salt, its caravans cutting trails through endless savanna. Even in Europe, populations have swelled. Historians estimate that by 1300, Europe boasted close to 80 million souls, more mouths to feed than ever before. The medieval warm period, a time of gentler winters and longer growing seasons, has allowed fields to yield more grain, vineyards to creep northward, and villages to expand into forests once thought impenetrable. But this is a fragile prosperity. The very success of these centuries has planted seeds of peril. Overpopulation strains the land. Fields are overworked. Soils grow tired and thin. There is little margin for failure. A single season of poor weather can tip a village into hunger. Two can tip it into catastrophe. And above, the climate itself is shifting. The medieval warm period is drawing to a close, replaced by whispers of a colder, harsher time that modern scholars will call the Little Ice Age. Winters grow a touch more bitter, harvests a touch less certain. Rains linger too long or fail altogether. It is a world balanced precariously on the edge of want. And then, as if the universe itself was sending cryptic warnings, the skies grow restless. Chronicles tell of comets blazing across the heavens, their ghostly tails regarded as harbingers of sorrow. Eclipses darken the sun, unsettling even the most devout, who murmur prayers against the shadow swallowing daylight. Astrologers peer at their fragile charts and predict turmoil, famine, war. Common folk gather at crossroads to stare upwards, crosses clutched to their chests, whispering that God's patience must surely be wearing thin. It is a nervous age, and in this climate of superstition and dread, nature sharpens its blade. Then comes a catastrophe not of swords but of rain. Beginning in 1315, unrelenting storms soak Europe. Rivers swell, fields turn to sucking mud, the seed rots in the furrows. When winter descends, granaries stand hauntingly empty. By 1316, starvation stalks village lanes, mothers hush crying children with empty promises, men comb forests for acorns and roots. Tales spread of people driven to unspeakable acts, of bodies lying unburied by roadsides, of thieves who steal the very shrouds from corpses. Though the famine recedes after 1317, it leaves behind a weakened people, bodies thin, immune systems battered, spirits shadowed by fresh memories of how quickly fortune can flee. Meanwhile, the subtle cooling of the world does more than trouble the fields. It nudges wildlife from old territories. Rodents, particularly black rats and the fleas they carry, creep closer to human settlements, seeking warmth, shelter, scraps. In ways no one at the time could fathom, these tiny wanderers are harbingers of an even darker tide. If you found yourself drawn into these quiet yet ominous moments of history, if you're the kind of person who savours long, richly woven stories about the forces that shaped our world, then I warmly invite you to subscribe to this channel. There's so much more ahead, and I would be honoured to have you along for each unfolding chapter. Share this video with someone who treasures stories that illuminate how deeply the past still echoes in our lives. Because truly, the journey we're about to take is too remarkable to keep to ourselves. It begins far from the quiet hamlets of France, or the bustling guild halls of Flanders. Our tale now shifts eastward, to the broad expanses of Central Asia, where emerald grasslands sway under the restless gallop of hooves. Throughout much of the 13th century, these plains have been welded into a vast empire under the Mongols. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, lands stretching from the steppes to the gates of Vienna find themselves linked by what later historians will call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. Merchants travel under the protection of mounted escorts. Way stations bloom along the routes, offering fresh horses, bowls of steaming broth, and rough beds of straw. Silks, spices, gems, and ideas flow in dazzling currents across this immense highway. So too, though unseen, do pathogens. In the bustling markets of Samarkand or Tabriz, merchants haggle over Persian rugs, Chinese lacquerware, Indian pepper. The very air carries a tang of excitement, possibility, and invisible risk. For amid the jostle of traders and the bleating of sheep led to slaughter, there is a quieter life. Rodents skittering under stalls, nesting in warm burlap sacks. Their fleas sip blood indiscriminately, ingesting bacteria that will soon rewrite the story of continents. The bacterium Yersinia pestis does not yet have a name. It lurks in the guts of fleas, waiting for a ride. When the flea bites a new host, rat, marmot, or eventually human, the plague takes its chance. In the decades just before the Great Outbreak, these regions see local flare-ups. Mongol armies besiege cities, disrupting rodent populations, sending infected rats scrambling into new burrows. Caravans pack up and move on, carrying with them both goods and a tiny, deadly stowaway. Meanwhile, in Europe, the years following the famine see tentative recovery. Fields slowly mend, populations inch upward again. Peasants return to tilling lands that just a few years earlier had been ghostly silent. Bells ring out to mark baptisms, marriages, burials, the cycles of life returning with cautious hope. Yet not all is well. Memories of hunger still haunt hearthside tales. A slight chill lingers longer each spring. Grain prices jitter nervously with every shift in the weather. No one suspects that these small disquiets are mere preludes to something far more catastrophic. Europe in these decades is deeply religious, its people accustomed to seeing God's hand in every lightning strike and every birth safely brought to term. Church walls glow with frescoes depicting heaven's rewards and hell's torments. Village priests preach of sin, redemption, and the thin veil between mortal life and eternal judgment. So when rumours begin to drift westward, vague tales carried by merchants and seamen of pestilence in distant lands, ears are already tuned to listen for omens. A comet appears once more in the night sky, drawing fiery lines above the darkened earth. Some kneel to pray, others whisper that the very stars are weeping for what is to come. Thus, by the early 1340s, the stage is meticulously set. A Europe somewhat recovered from famine, but still fragile, fields labouring to feed mouths that once again multiply, a peasantry bound by duty, yet increasingly restless under taxes and dues, markets bustling with imported luxuries that cross countless borders. And all across these same trade routes, small grey bodies scuttle, scratch, and shed their fleas, leaving behind a silent promise of devastation. The calm before the storm is often the most deceptive. It invites complacency. It lulls souls into believing that tomorrow will look much like today. But our long journey together is only just beginning, and it will lead us into streets where carts overflow with the dead, into chambers where lords and peasants alike whisper their final prayers, and ultimately into fields where new freedoms will timidly sprout from soil watered by unfathomable grief. Stretching from the rolling grasslands of Hungary all the way to the Great Wall of China, the Eurasian steppe is a sea of undulating green and brown. Here, hardy grasses wave under winds that never seem to rest. Herds of wild horses thunder across the plains, and nomadic families pack their entire lives onto ox-drawn carts following the seasons. This is the homeland of marmots and gerbils, small creatures that dig intricate burrows beneath the turf. In these hidden warrens, the bubonic plague has long found a quiet refuge. The bacteria Yersinia pestis dwells comfortably within rodent hosts, and the fleas that drink from them circulating year after year in a deadly but balanced dance. Among marmots, plague erupts now and then, killing many, but never threatening to spill far beyond their isolated colonies. For centuries, it remains a local peril, devastating to rodent populations, but largely unnoticed by the wider world. But the balance of these wild places is delicate, and as human ambitions grow, so too does the risk of tipping this natural harmony into catastrophe. In the early 13th century, a remarkable force emerges from these very steppes: the Mongol tribes, united under the iron will of Genghis Khan. Their conquests are swift and terrible. Cities fall like dominoes: Samarkand, Baghdad, Kiev, their walls breached by relentless cavalry, their streets choked with dust and dread. Yet, from this trail of conquest arises something unexpected, an unprecedented network of unified lands, stretching from the shores of the Pacific to the edges of Europe. The Mongol Empire, at its height, becomes a single, vast canvas across which merchants, missionaries, scholars, and yes, pathogens can travel with startling ease. Under Mongol rule, caravans feel safer, bandits are hunted down with ruthless efficiency, roads are maintained, passports called paidzi grant passage from one relay station to the next. Goods flow west and east with a vigour the world has never seen. From Persian dyes to Chinese paper money, from Venetian glass to Mongol felt, an extraordinary exchange of commodities, cultures, and microbes begins. Among the hidden travelers in this great tide of commerce are fleas infected with Yersinia pestis. Clinging to rat fur, nestled in caravan grain sacks, these tiny passengers will soon become the dark heralds of a new epoch. By the 1330s, signs of mounting catastrophe begin to appear in the east. In the chronicles kept by local officials of the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol-ruled China founded by Kublai Khan, there are unsettling references to mysterious outbreaks. Villages report sudden horrifying deaths. Entire households vanish in mere days. Chroniclers write of bodies blackened by strange swellings, of streets eerily quiet where once merchants shouted prices and children played. Though estimates vary, some modern historians believe that millions perish in these early waves of plague. Chinese society reels. Famine and flooding compound the chaos. The authority of the Yuan emperors, already fraying under the weight of administrative complexity and popular discontent, grows still more tenuous. Peasants whisper that heaven itself is withdrawing its mandate, that the strange pestilence is proof the dynasty's time is drawing to an end. Yet commerce does not halt. Despite the suffering, the Silk Road continues to pulse with caravans laden with bolts of brocade, crates of lapis lazuli, jars of ginger and pepper. From the bustling docks of Changzhou in China, ships with layered sails set forth, their holds crowded with spices and ceramics, bound for ports as distant as Calicut and Alexandria. Rats scurry along the mooring ropes. Fleas leap from hide to hide. In the cosy darkness of cargo holds, they find all they need to thrive. And so the plague rides outward, westward across the caravan trails that lace through oases like Kashgar and Samarkand, through Persian valleys where minarets pierce sapphire skies, across the arid plateaus of Anatolia, finally to the bustling ports along the Black Sea. No one at the time understands this hidden tide. To traders and pilgrims, the world remains filled with promise. Profits to be made, souls to be saved, adventures to be had. They cannot see the far deadlier cargo moving with them, patient and utterly indifferent to their ambitions. In this way, by the middle of the 14th century, the plague finds itself perched at the very doorstep of Europe, poised to make its fateful entrance. Far to the northwest of Persia's saffron markets and China's porcelain kilns lies the dark, restless expanse of the Black Sea. Here, along its sun-bleached northern shores, Italian merchants have carved out enclaves, vibrant little pockets of Latin Christendom bristling with ships and shouting dock workers. Among these is the bustling port of Kaffa, or Kaffa, a fortified trading colony established by Genoa on the Crimean Peninsula. Stone walls bristle with towers, gates clang shut each evening, and inside, narrow lanes echo with voices speaking Ligurian, Greek, Tartar, Armenian. Silk from China hangs beside Venetian glass. Grain from the Ukrainian steppes is loaded onto cogs destined for Constantinople and beyond. The Genoese have come here for profit, drawn by the riches of east-west commerce. They live cheek by jowl with native Tartars and visiting Mongol dignitaries. Caravans arrive from the heart of Asia, their camels groaning under bales of trade goods. It is a cosmopolitan swirl, a last great gathering point before Europe proper. But among the sacks of saffron and barrels of salt fish, the rats have also come, and with them their patient fleas. In 1346, tensions that have long simmered between the Genoese merchants and the local Mongol Tartar lords boil into open conflict. Khan Janibeg, ruling the Golden Horde, brings his army to the walls of Kaffa. Battering rams pound the gates, arrows darken the skies. Within the city, fear festers, but so too does determination, for the Genoese are well armed and well supplied. Then, something dreadful happens in the Mongol camp. Plague erupts among the besieging soldiers. Chroniclers later speak of men falling where they stood, black swellings bursting along their armpits and groins, corpses piling up so quickly that burial becomes impossible. Faced with the horrifying prospect of an army wasting away before their eyes, the Mongols decide on a desperate, grisly tactic. They load the pestilence-ravaged bodies onto great catapults, engines once meant for hurling stones at battlements, and fling the rotting corpses over Kaffa's walls. In an instant, medieval warfare crosses into biological terror. The Genoese within the city scramble to heave the bloated bodies into mass graves, but it is too late. Rats and fleas are not so easily contained. The plague takes hold inside the cramped quarters of merchants, sailors and soldiers. With their city's fate hanging by a thread, the Genoese make a fateful choice. They rush to their ships, casting off ropes, unfurling sails to catch the winds that will carry them away from the doomed siege. Galleys and cogs, packed with desperate merchants, frightened families and crews, unaware they are already infected, slip out into the Black Sea. They steer for home, to Genoa, to Venice, to Messina in Sicily, hoping to outrun the horror now loose among them. But below deck, in the dark holds where rats scurry over spilled grain, the plague travels with them. Every lapping wave carries them closer, not to safety, but to the first dark chapters of Europe's greatest calamity. Soon these ships will dock. Sailors will stagger ashore seeking food, trade, confession. Rats will spill down gangplanks. Fleas will leap to new hosts. And thus, the stage, laid across continents by decades of trade and conquest, will finally deliver its tragic performance in the streets and squares of Europe. For centuries, the Mediterranean Sea have been a highway of commerce, culture, and crusade. Now, they are about to become a conduit for something far more sinister. It is October of 1347, when a clutch of Genoese trading vessels, fleeing the horrors of Kaffa, finally limps into the harbour of Messina on the island of Sicily. Dock workers hurry down the piers to help tie up the ships. Local merchants come to see if silks or spices are for sale. But instead of lively chatter from the deck, there is only silence, punctuated by ragged coughs. As the city's officials climb aboard to inspect the ships, they recoil at the sight. Crewmen lie sprawled on filthy straw, groaning, their bodies marked by large, dark swellings. Buboes, some as big as eggs, tender and purple-black. Others are already dead, their limbs stiff, faces frozen in masks of agony. Rats skitter unnoticed among the cargo, fleas dropping off their fur, eager for new blood. Panicked, Messina's authorities order the ships out of the harbour almost at once. But it is too late. Merchants, sailors, even curious onlookers have already mingled with the infected. Rats scuttle down mooring ropes to the docks. Fleas leap to waiting hosts. The plague is ashore. From this first tragic landfall in Sicily, the contagion will radiate outward in all directions, borne by terrified people trying to outrun it, by thriving markets that refuse to close, by the very rhythms of medieval life. Before the year is out, the disease travels to the great port cities of Genoa and Venice. Here, amid the gondolas gliding beneath arched bridges and the bustling quays stacked with amphorae of wine and olive oil, the plague finds fresh hosts. Venetian merchants, eager not to lose profit, continue their voyages to Marseille. In December 1347, Marseille, a city accustomed to welcoming pilgrims and traders from across the Mediterranean, receives ships carrying the invisible invader. Within weeks, bodies begin to pile up in narrow streets scented with garlic and fish. Doctors scratch their heads, priests chant ever more fervent prayers, flagellants whip themselves in public squares, hoping to appease an angry god. But the disease moves too swiftly for understanding or penitence to catch it. Caravans carry infected goods inland. Sailors depart on new voyages, taking the plague wherever their contracts demand.
By early 1348, the plague's deadly march accelerates, its reach widening like dark ink spilling across a map. In France, it tears through Provence, up the Rhône Valley to Avignon, the seat of the papacy at this time. Even the Pope's own attendants succumb. Fires are lit around the pontiff in desperate hope that the heat might cleanse the air. By spring, it strikes Spain, sweeping through Aragon and Castile, devastating towns that had only recently rejoiced in the wealth of new trade from the Mediterranean. Then onward to the green fields of England. Ships from Gascony bring the contagion to Dorset in June 1348, then to Bristol, one of the busiest ports in the realm. From there, it radiates along market roads to London, where bells toll so often for the dead that their sound becomes part of the city's grim daily music. The following year, 1349, sees the plague press into Scandinavia, and the German principalities. Merchants from Lübeck carry it up the Baltic. Danish and Swedish ports, reliant on grain and timber exchange, become fresh nodes of infection. By 1350, the pestilence crosses into Poland and the lands of Russia, reaching even Novgorod, where fur traders still barter for sable and silver despite the rumours that ghostly ships are bringing something worse than wolves. Everywhere it travels, the plague leaves streets emptied of song and laughter, fields untended, hearths cold, yet trade continues, war continues. The old wheels of medieval life turn on, though now creaking under the weight of so much grief. The Mediterranean does not only lap at European shores. Across the waters lie the bustling ports of the Maghreb and the thriving cities of Egypt. In Cairo, jewel of the Islamic world under the Mamluk sultans, the plague descends with terrifying ferocity. Markets once choked with incense and shouting traders grow eerily subdued. Chroniclers record that thousands die daily, with funeral processions winding ceaselessly through the narrow streets. From Cairo, the contagion travels along the pilgrimage routes to Mecca, where the faithful from every corner of the Muslim world gather, unwittingly becoming new carriers. Some historians believe this religious circulation may have helped push the plague further into the Arabian Peninsula and along the trade arteries that lead east. Even further afield, through the busy entrepôts of the Persian Gulf and the great merchant cities along the western coast of India, there are fragmented records and local traditions that hint at outbreaks. Ships from Hormuz and Basra, laden with Persian carpets and dates, dock at ports like Cambay and Calicut, possibly bringing fleas and plague with them. Though the evidence grows thinner here, scattered references in Persian medical treatises, echoes in later local chronicles, it suggests that the Black Death was not solely a European or Middle Eastern catastrophe. Its reach may have touched the shores of India and perhaps even nudged further east, mingling with older endemic diseases that often blurred into one another in local memory. Thus, in just a handful of years, from a few infected rodents on the steppes to every corner of the known world, the plague establishes itself as the first truly global pandemic, exploiting the very trade networks that once seemed to promise only prosperity. As the plague gnaws its way through towns and countrysides, it unravels not only bodies, but also the threads of certainty and order that people once clung to. In Europe, the first and most instinctive recourse is spiritual. Cathedrals echo with masses sung for deliverance. Processions wind through cobbled streets under drooping banners depicting saints and the Virgin. Monks chant litanies by candlelight until their voices crack. But as the death toll rises, a dreadful truth becomes clear. The sacraments do not halt the plague. Priests themselves die in droves, often more quickly than the lay people they try to console, for they are constantly at bedsides, anointing the sick with holy oil, hearing final confessions. Many parishes are left entirely without clergy. In Avignon, terrified of contagion, Pope Clement VI retreats behind thick walls. Chroniclers tell us he surrounds himself with toroidal fires, burning day and night, in the belief that the flames will purify the air. When prayers seem to fail, some turn to more desperate displays of penitence. Bands of flagellants emerge, first in Germany, then sweeping across the Low Countries and France. Hundreds travel barefoot from town to town, clad in simple linen garments, chanting hymns and psalms. At appointed stops, they form circles, strip to the waist and lash themselves with knotted cords tipped in metal spikes. Blood runs down their backs. Children cry at the sight. Onlookers weep or join in. This, they believe, will appease divine wrath, a visible sacrifice of human flesh to atone for sins that surely have brought God's judgment upon them. Elsewhere, fear curdles into suspicion and hatred. Rumours swirl that the plague is not natural, that it must have been caused by malicious human hands. In the Rhineland and Switzerland, pogroms erupt against Jewish communities, falsely accused of poisoning wells. Entire neighbourhoods are herded into wooden buildings that are then set alight. In many places, local lords who once protected these minorities now step aside, either cowed by the mob or eager to cancel debts owed to Jewish moneylenders. Thus, the plague does more than destroy bodies. It destroys the fragile bonds of trust and tolerance that had held diverse communities together. As months stretch into years, the sheer relentlessness of death changes how people treat each other. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio later writes that brother abandoned brother, uncle his nephew, wife her husband. Children die alone because their parents flee rather than risk infection. Funeral customs wither under the weight of numbers. Where once solemn processions might wind through streets with candles and bells, now plague pits yawn open on the edge of towns, filled by cartloads of corpses dumped in haste. Mass graves are layered like grisly pastries. Bodies, thin coating of dirt, more bodies. In many places, priests can no longer keep up with last rites. Gravediggers work until they themselves collapse. Dogs and scavenging birds circle at the edges. Strangely, amid all this horror, an unexpected consequence emerges. As entire villages stand half empty, fields go untilled, mills go silent, and once busy workshops echo with silence. The sudden scarcity of labour gives surviving workers new leverage. In parts of England and northern France, records show wages for farmhands and artisans beginning to rise sharply. Lords and town councils try to set maximum wages by law. In England, the Ordinance of Labourers, 1349, tries to freeze pay at pre-plague levels. But enforcement proves nearly impossible when the fields must be sown and there are too few hands to do it. Thus, ironically, the seeds of economic change are sown even amid this devastation. Labourers begin to realise their worth, and old hierarchies start to quiver under the strain. By 1353, the worst waves of the plague begin to ebb. Towns and cities emerge blinking into a strange new dawn. The social fabric is torn, many noble lineages extinguished, monasteries half vacant, trade routes haunted by memories of ghost ships. Chroniclers try to tally the dead. Some say a third of Europe's people have vanished, others suggest half. The truth may lie somewhere in between, but the precise number matters less than the universal reality. Everyone has lost someone. Yet life proves stubborn. Children are born, markets reopen, fields are ploughed again, and beneath the surface the great gears of society have begun to shift. Changes that will, in time, help to unravel the old feudal order. Even after it had swept through the ports and crept inland across Europe's arteries, the Black Death revealed itself in grotesque, unmistakable ways. Imagine the dim interiors of medieval cottages, rush-strewn floors, smoky air from hearth fires, suddenly pierced by the low moans of the afflicted. A man who had been working the fields or selling his wares in the market only a day before now lies twisted on a straw pallet, sweating through his tunic. Medieval chronicles preserve the awful sequence. First there was a fever, sudden and violent, burning through the body. The skin grew hot to the touch, eyes glazed, speech thick. Then came the buboes, swollen lymph nodes, most often in the groin, armpit, or neck. They could grow as large as apples, dark and tender, hot under the skin. Monks recorded how the buboes often split open, oozing foul-smelling pus. Sometimes these swellings would shrink, and for a desperate moment the family would dare to hope. More often, black patches, gangrenous necrosis, began to spread across limbs and torsos, turning living flesh into a map of rot. From these dark blotches the disease took another name, the Black Death. In the final hours the tongue swelled, breath grew shallow, the mind clouded by delirium. Many died within 3 days of first symptoms, some within 24 hours. Families stood by powerless, clutching rosaries, hoping for miracles that did not come. Faced with this unrelenting horror, medieval medicine was painfully ill-equipped. Their understanding of disease rested on the ancient humoral theory that health depended on a balance of 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness meant imbalance, to be corrected by diet, purging, or bloodletting. Thus many plague victims had their veins opened. Leeches were applied. Physicians encouraged them to drink herbal tinctures or to sweat it out under piles of blankets. Some tried poultices of crushed onions, vinegar, or even arsenic spread over the buboes, hoping to draw out the poison. They believed the plague was spread by miasma, corrupted, stinking air, which is why cities reeked of burning juniper, rosemary, or even piles of sweet-scented herbs set alight at street corners. In Avignon, great fires burned day and night. In Venice, ships suspected of carrying plague were forced to wait offshore for 40 days, a quarantenaria, from which we derive the word quarantine. And then there were the plague doctors, ghostly figures who haunt our imaginations to this day, dressed in long leather or waxed canvas coats, gloves, wide-brimmed hats, and that eerie beaked mask. The beak was stuffed with aromatic substances, lavender, mint, cloves, meant to filter and purify the air. But the real protection these costumes offered was minimal. The doctors would move from patient to patient, prodding buboes with a stick, scribbling notes, offering last prayers. Many of them perished alongside those they treated. As the death toll mounted, burial customs, so central to medieval Christian life, collapsed. There were simply too many bodies. In London, Florence, Paris, and countless lesser towns, carts rolled down the streets each morning with men calling out, "Bring out your dead." Families laid loved ones wrapped in linen on the threshold. Sometimes they left them in the street, fearing to keep the infected corpse within their walls even a few hours longer. Gravediggers, themselves often criminals or the desperately poor, dragged these bodies to hastily dug trenches. Chroniclers describe layers upon layers of corpses, sprinkled with quicklime, then more dirt, then more bodies, a grotesque parody of sowing a field. Bell ringers trudged from house to house, sounding a dull, mournful note that meant someone within was dying. Over time, the sound itself became a kind of haunting, a sonic symbol of the ever-looming spectre of death. And so trauma embedded itself deeply in the cultural memory. Mothers grew numb to the cries of children, husbands turned from wives, villages stood half empty, fields choked with weeds, livestock wandering unmilked and unshorn. As the plague scythed across the land, people turned desperately to explanations rooted in their deepest fears and hopes. For many, this was the wrath of God made manifest. Sin, both personal and collective, must have provoked such punishment. Church sermons thundered with calls for repentance. In the countryside and cities alike, the flagellant movement surged. Barefoot, stripped to the waist, these men moved in solemn lines from village to village, chanting psalms and whipping their own backs until blood ran down in rivulets. The sight was both terrifying and magnetic. Crowds gathered to weep, pray, or join them. Yet such displays could not stop the plague. Instead, fear often twisted into persecution. In countless towns along the Rhine and across parts of France and Spain, Jewish communities became scapegoats, accused of poisoning wells or conjuring the plague by dark rites. Under torture, some confessed to crimes they never committed. Entire communities were slaughtered, their homes looted, synagogues burned. The plague thus not only revealed human mortality, but also human cruelty, sharpening suspicions into knives. Even as mass graves swallowed the dead and the bells of funeral processions grew hoarse, human beings reached for meaning in the midst of chaos. Artists, poets, and chroniclers found themselves driven to capture this vast calamity, to give it form, if not reason. One of the most haunting artistic legacies to emerge in the decades following the plague was the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death. These were murals painted on church walls, carvings on tombs, illustrations in manuscripts, skeletal figures, death personified, leading kings, bishops, merchants, peasants all in a grisly chain. No rank, no title could exempt anyone from the final summons. A bishop, crozier still in hand, dances with a robed skeleton. A plump merchant grips his money bag even as bony fingers close around his wrist. A bride in flowing veils spins helplessly with her skeletal partner. These images were not merely grim, they were instructive. They reminded every onlooker that life was fleeting, earthly splendour vain, and only the state of one's soul would matter when the final bell tolled. Meanwhile, writers recorded, with both horror and strange fascination, the world unravelling around them. Giovanni Boccaccio, in his Decameron, begins by describing Florence gripped by plague. Streets empty, churches deserted, neighbours turning against each other. The rest of his book follows a group of young men and women who flee to a countryside villa to escape infection, passing the days telling stories, a subtle testament to how life and art continue, even under the shadow of doom. Petrarch, the great poet and humanist, wrote anguished letters after the death of his beloved Laura, blaming the cruel plague that robbed him of her. His sonnets pulse with a personal grief that mirrored a continent's collective mourning. In England, William Langland's Piers Plowman, though written slightly later, carries echoes of a world destabilised by mortality and the failures of religious leaders. The plague had become a lens through which writers question not only divine justice, but the very structure of society. Elsewhere, local chronicles simply tried to record facts, though often shaded by despair. In England, monks kept terse entries. In this year, 1349, the great mortality reached our town, and so many died there was no one left to bury the dead. In France, a scribe lamented that fields lay untilled for lack of labourers and entire villages fell into ruin. Through these fragments, we hear a chorus of voices, confused, terrified, trying to make sense of a calamity that seemed to defy all precedent. As the bodies accumulated, so too did subtle shifts in power. Europe had been a world ordered by feudal obligations, serfs tied to the land, bound by rents and dues, labouring under the watchful eyes of lords. But the plague changed this balance in ways that no army ever could. So many peasants died that lords found their lands going to seed. Fields were left fallow for lack of hands to plough them. Sheep wandered untended across meadows. Mills stood silent. Desperate for workers, many landowners offered better terms, reduced rents, even wages paid in coin rather than in service. Some peasants, sensing this new leverage, packed up and moved to where wages were highest. Others simply refused old obligations, knowing there was no one to enforce them. In parts of England, records show entire villages abandoned, their names now lingering only in ghostly church ruins, swallowed by ivy. Thus began a quiet revolution. It was not born of pitched battles, but of contracts renegotiated under the shadow of mass graves. The very scarcity of life gave the survivors unexpected power. Alarmed by this unravelling of the old order, rulers tried to stem the tide. In England, King Edward III issued the Ordinance of Labourers, 1349, and later the Statute of Labourers, 1351, decreeing that wages must return to pre-plague levels, and that peasants could not seek employment beyond their own manors. But these laws were often impossible to enforce. In many regions, there simply were not enough people to fill the fields or workshops. Local lords turned a blind eye, rather than let their estates go bankrupt. Thus, attempts to restore the old equilibrium only highlighted how profoundly the plague had tilted society. Feudal obligations were weakened, a crack that over the next century would widen into outright revolts. Meanwhile, the spiritual landscape shifted too. Many found their faith tested by the sight of priests and bishops dying in the same agony as their flock. Entire monasteries were decimated. Some saw this as proof of universal human frailty, others as evidence that God's earthly representatives were no more favoured than the poorest serf. At the same time, popular piety flourished. Lay people gathered in confraternities, organising their own processions, caring for the sick when priests were too few. Mystical movements spread, emphasising direct personal devotion, visions, and penitential rituals. This subtle reordering of religious life would, in later centuries, help prepare the ground for far more radical transformations of belief. From the chill echo of empty churches, we drift gently outward again, to the quiet countryside, where the first true economic tremors began to roll through Europe. In village after village, fields lay unploughed. Orchards grew wild, branches heavy with fruit that no hand came to pick, grain withered on the stalk. In some regions, wolves prowled closer to settlements than ever before, emboldened by the stillness. Entire manors, once bustling with peasants tending the Lord's demesne, fell into eerie calm. The clang of iron-shod wheels, the cries of drovers, the songs of harvesters, all were hushed. In their place, only the rustle of wind through untended wheat. The plague had carved deep into the peasant population. In England alone, estimates suggest that by 1350, up to half the rural labour force had vanished. Across France's patchwork of vineyards and farms, the story was the same. In Tuscany's olive groves, in the Rhineland's barley fields, everywhere, hands were lacking. In this emptiness, something startling began to emerge. Survivors realized that their labor, once taken for granted, had become precious. Peasants who in earlier decades would have bowed their heads to the steward's summons now found themselves in short supply. Many landlords, desperate to keep their estates productive, offered wages where once they demanded free service. They competed with neighbouring lords, hoping to lure peasants with promises of better conditions, lighter rents, more land to farm, even outright cash. Imagine it, a village reeve travelling from manor to manor, negotiating terms. A widow with sons might insist on twice the customary pay for their harvest work. A ploughman might demand the right to keep part of the grain he reaped, not just a meagre wage. This was not yet rebellion. It was necessity driving new relationships. But in these quiet bargains struck under thatched eaves or on muddy cart paths, the old feudal certainties began to fray. Alarmed by rising wages and the unsettling sight of peasants bargaining almost as equals, the English crown under King Edward III sought to slam the door shut. In 1351, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, a law born of fear more than strategy. It decreed that wages must not exceed pre-plague levels, those of 1346. Workers could be compelled to work at these old rates or face imprisonment. Masters and landlords who paid more were fined. In effect, it was an attempt to rewind time, to conjure back the world before the plague's upheaval. But the disease had done more than kill bodies, it had shifted power. Enforcement proved patchy at best. Local juries, drawn from the same villages as the labourers, often hesitated to convict neighbours for seeking a better bargain. Landlords themselves sometimes quietly ignored the statute, paying higher wages to ensure their fields did not lie idle. Still, resentment brewed. The sense that the mighty sought to chain the poor precisely when they were most needed would linger like smoke, waiting for the spark of open revolt. Nor was this drama confined to England. In France, ordinances were issued in Normandy and Languedoc, seeking to pin wages to old levels. Local lords sometimes took matters into their own hands, threatening fines or eviction. Yet, as in England, many quietly conceded higher payments rather than risk deserted farms. In the Italian city-states, where textile workshops depended on rural wool and labourers, guilds tried to impose wage caps, with limited success. In Florence, weavers and dyers began to demand more pay, knowing well how many of their fellows had been carried off. In the German principalities, especially in the Rhineland and Bavaria, bishops and secular rulers issued decrees to curb peasants from moving too freely, fearing that entire estates would be left without tenants. But it was like trying to dam a river already swollen past its banks. The flow of labour, now the most valuable commodity in Europe, could not be so easily contained. Men and women walked from village to village, seeking the best offers. Entire families relocated, chasing rumours of higher wages or lighter dues. In these years immediately following the plague, most of Europe teetered on a fragile edge. Lords and town councils grew ever more anxious, seeing their customary incomes dwindle, their control over labour slip away. Peasants and artisans felt emboldened, or at least desperate enough, to seize whatever small advantage the catastrophe had granted them. It was not yet revolution, but it was something new and unsettling, a recognition, however dim, that the social pyramid, long upheld by divine sanction and custom, could shift under the sheer weight of death and scarcity. As the plague retreated in waves, leaving behind empty cottages and new graves marked by simple wooden crosses, a different kind of emptiness began to spread, this time within hearts. The faithful flocked to churches seeking comfort, kneeling on cold stone floors, whispering prayers that trembled with desperation. Why had God allowed such horror? What sin had been so great that half of Christendom was struck down? Yet often, the very people meant to answer, the priests, the bishops, even the humble parish monks, were missing. Across Europe, the clergy had died in shocking numbers, ministering last rites to the sick, burying plague victims, then succumbing themselves. In some dioceses, entire ranks of priests vanished. In England, it was recorded that over half of all parish priests perished in certain counties. The University of Paris lamented the loss of learned theologians.
In Florence, Boccaccio noted how people died without confession, without absolution, without the toll of bells. Where priests did survive, many were hastily elevated, sometimes barely trained, to fill gaping vacancies. The quality of spiritual guidance slipped. Stories spread of priests who fled at the first sign of disease, or who grew drunk and reckless, having lost all hope in divine protection. This crisis hollowed the church's prestige. If God's ministers could die like any peasant, if their prayers could not halt the pestilence, what certainty remained? Into this void spilled other currents. With official channels weakened, people turned to more intimate, more mystical practices of faith. Small shrines multiplied along roadsides and in village greens. Tales of local saints spread like wildfire, men and women who supposedly survived the plague by miraculous means, whose relics might offer protection. Confraternities formed, lay brotherhoods that organized processions, recited penitential psalms, carried statues of the Virgin through dusty lanes. In some towns, groups of flagellants appeared, men who marched from village to village, whipping their backs until the flesh split, believing that shared agony might appease God's wrath. Meanwhile, astrology and old folk superstitions blended with half-remembered church doctrine. People tied charms of dried herbs around their necks, wore amulets inscribed with cryptic prayers, or turned to cunning women who promised cures brewed from sage, rue, and whispered invocations. This flowering of alternative devotions was not merely harmless, it signalled a shifting trust, away from the towering cathedrals and Latin masses, toward more personal, often heterodox attempts to grasp divine favour. In these years, seeds were sown that centuries later would flower into direct challenges to Rome itself. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, the unity of medieval Christendom began to fray. And not all turned to prayer. Fear demanded culprits. In darkened taverns, over barrels of ale, villagers whispered of poisons, wells fouled by unseen hands, strange powders scattered at thresholds. Who could have done such things? Who had brought the plague, if not God? Old resentments quickly found new fuel. Jewish communities, long segregated by custom and prejudice, became convenient targets. Rumours flared that Jews had conspired to poison water sources to destroy Christendom. From the Rhineland to Savoy, from Aragon to Switzerland, mobs stormed Jewish quarters, torching homes, massacring entire neighbourhoods. In Strasbourg, on Valentine's Day, 1349, hundreds of Jews were herded onto a wooden platform and burned alive. The city fathers then banned Jews from ever returning, at least until debts owed to them required convenient forgetting. Elsewhere, whispers of witchcraft rose. Who had escaped the plague untouched? Who kept oddly healthy cattle while neighbours' herds died? Old women living on the margins, midwives with herb lore, men with a talent for weather prediction. Any might find themselves accused. Inquisitors travelled with heavy books of questions, keen to extract confessions under threat or torture. Thus did the plague birth not only a terror of death, but a terror of one another. By the end of the plague's first great wave, Europe was spiritually shaken. Church attendance still filled pews, but with a new, uneasy edge. People prayed harder, or they drifted to private devotions, suspicious of priests who had failed to protect them. The sight of charred ruins where once vibrant Jewish communities had stood, or the lonely cottage of a woman vanished after accusations of witchcraft, were mute witnesses to a continent desperate for explanations. The old world of certain hierarchies, priests above layfolk, Christian above Jew, sanctioned miracle above folk charm, still stood, but its foundations were cracked. As Europe staggered to its feet, gathering up the pieces of its shattered world, a quiet hope began to stir. Fields slowly refilled with labourers. Markets reopened beneath brightly painted banners. Bells tolled once more for weddings and baptisms, not just funerals. But this hope proved fragile, for the plague was not done with Europe. What we today call the second pandemic was not a single cataclysmic strike,
but a long, grim series of blows that echoed through more than 3 centuries. The first great recurrence came in 1361, only a decade after the initial devastation. Chroniclers in England and France recorded that this wave seemed especially cruel to children and youths. The very generation born in the brief lull after the Black Death was now cut down in droves. In the parish rolls of Norfolk, or the tax registers of Burgundy, one sees families who had rebuilt, only to watch the new young heirs vanish. Villagers buried not the old this time, but bright-haired boys, who might have ploughed the fields, girls who might have borne the next generation. Then came 1369, another surge. And after that, like a dark tide, obeying no calendar save its own, the plague returned roughly every decade. In 1374, 1382, 1390, then on through the 15th century. Each wave was not quite as catastrophic as the original onslaught, but each reopened fresh wounds. Some towns, spared in 1348, suffered horribly later. Others, already battered, found their hopes of regrowth thwarted again and again. Imagine living under such a sky, knowing that at any moment the familiar signs might appear. The sudden swelling in a neighbour's neck, the darkening of skin, the faint but terrible rumour of ships arriving with sickness aboard. This was not a single nightmare that passed with dawn. It was a lingering horror that shaped the very rhythm of European life. In time, communities sought to wrest some control from fate. It was in Venice, that glittering republic of merchants and mariners, that the world first saw systematic efforts to contain plague by separating the sick and the suspect. The Venetians depended utterly on trade, yet they also understood that every galley bringing spices or silks from the Levant might just as easily carry death. So by the early 1400s, Venice established special lazarettos, island stations where arriving ships, crews, passengers and cargo could be detained. The term itself drew from Lazarus, the biblical beggar covered in sores. If disease showed itself, the afflicted were isolated there, kept from the crowded streets of the city proper. And out of Venice's decrees arose a word that would shape centuries of public health: quarantine. It came from the Venetian dialect, 40 giorni, meaning 40 days, the prescribed period ships had to wait offshore before they could dock. Other ports soon imitated this. Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, was among the earliest, followed by Genoa and Marseille. Over time, even inland towns established pest houses, crude precursors to hospitals, where plague victims could be sequestered. None of this could stop the disease entirely. Fleas and rats did not respect human laws, but it marked a profound shift, a recognition that civic authority bore responsibility for collective health, and that human action might at least slow the hand of fate. Through these repeated strikes, Europe gradually settled into a new demographic reality. The population had been deeply gouged by the initial Black Death. Modern estimates suggest Europe lost between 30% to 50% of its people in just a few brief years. And because of the repeated waves, recovery was painfully slow. Decade after decade, villages remained only half filled. Entire hamlets disappeared from maps, their names lingering solely in faded charters or carved on mossy stones beside ancient roads. Forests crept back over abandoned farmland. Wolves, once driven far from settled lands, grew bold, sometimes attacking even near market towns. It would take roughly until 1500, a century and a half after the first great onslaught, before Europe's population climbed back to what it had been in the sunny days before 1347. This long underpopulation brought lasting consequences. Labour remained scarce for generations, helping sustain higher wages for peasants and artisans. Lords struggled to refill their manors. The tight squeeze of overpopulation that had strained food supplies in the early 1300s did not reappear for many decades. Yet it also meant fewer hands to till the soil, fewer mouths to buy goods in town markets, fewer coins to ring in cathedral alms boxes. Europe was quieter, emptier, haunted by invisible absences. As the decades passed and the repeated waves of plague finally ebbed into memory, Europe's fields and towns began to settle into a new, striking reality. There were simply fewer people. This scarcity transformed everything, especially the age-old bond that had tied peasant to lord. Before the Black Death, Europe had been crowded. Too many labourers chased too little land. allowing landlords to dictate harsh terms. Serfs were bound by custom and law, obliged to provide corvée labour, days each week working the lord's own lands, and to pay rents in crops, chickens or coin. They needed permission to marry, to move, even to pass their holdings on to heirs. But now, with fields lying idle and many manors short of hands to bring in the harvest, the balance quietly began to tilt. Peasants found they could negotiate, sometimes subtly, sometimes boldly. If one lord would not ease obligations, another, desperate to have his demesne ploughed, might promise lighter burdens, or offer actual wages instead of demanding days of forced labour. In many regions, lords competed to attract scarce tenants. Labour was no longer an abundant commodity. The peasants, for the first time in centuries, discovered they had economic leverage. This new mobility was more than just bargaining. It became, in many places, outright flight. Across England, France and the Low Countries, manorial records show sudden gaps, peasants who vanished from the rolls. Villages sometimes shrank to a handful of stubborn households, the rest having left in search of better lords, more generous leases, or richer soil. This slow erosion of the old system was like a quiet revolution. The rigid ties of feudal obligation, once enforced by custom and local courts, began to fray under the sheer pressure of necessity, and often it was the young who left first. A spirited daughter or a strong-armed son might slip away by night, travelling dusty roads to market towns where demand for labourers soared. There they could hire out by the day or season, living with far fewer obligations, their earnings entirely their own. Meanwhile, on the neglected manors they left behind, lords faced stark choices. Either adapt, offering more freedom, wages, or outright leases, or see their estates crumble. But in some places, lords and governments resisted fiercely. They passed laws to freeze wages, to tie labourers back to the land, to claw back old customs by statute. This was tinder for open revolt. In England, resentment flared into the Great Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Sparked by harsh poll taxes and attempts to enforce the Statute of Labourers, which tried to cap wages at pre-plague levels, peasants in Kent and Essex rose in furious columns. They marched on London under banners of St. George, demanding an end to serfdom, the reduction of rents, and the dismissal of corrupt royal officials. The chronicler Froissart watched with astonishment as these once humble peasants stormed the city, even executing the Archbishop of Canterbury on Tower Hill. Though King Richard II ultimately suppressed the uprising, it left a lasting mark, a trembling awareness among the elite that their peasants were no longer passive. France saw its own boiling point in 1358, during the chaos after the first plague wave. Here, in the fertile lands north of Paris, peasants launched the Jacquerie, attacking castles, killing nobles, destroying manorial records. It was a short, bloody uprising, crushed with brutal reprisals, but it revealed the same explosive pressures. Germany would witness similar outbursts later, most dramatically in the early 16th century, when memories of plague scarcity still undergirded demands for better terms. Out of this turmoil, a quieter revolution unfolded in manorial contracts. In region after region, lords began to commute labour obligations into cash rents. Instead of demanding a peasant work 2 days a week on the demesne, they took silver coins. Instead of enforcing corvée road building, they hired paid crews. Some peasants were formally manumitted, granted freedom from their serf status for a fee, or simply by lordly decree when enforcement became too costly. Records survive of entire villages being freed in return for lump sums. This did not mean peasants were suddenly prosperous. Many still struggled under taxes, rents and local dues. But the shift from personal bondage, being tied to the land with obligations to ask permission to leave or marry, toward a system of rent-paying tenancies was profound. A new social contract was being drafted, not by the stroke of any king's pen, but by countless small bargains, local crises and mutual needs. Yet this was not Europe's universal story. In Western Europe, in England, northern France, the Low Countries, the shortage of labour, combined with the bargaining power of peasants and the competition between lords, led steadily toward the decline of serfdom. By 1500, outright serfdom had largely faded in these regions. replaced by wage labour and cash rents. But in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland, Hungary, and Eastern German lands, a very different pattern emerged. Here, nobles faced similar depopulation, but often held tighter legal control. Over the 15th and 16th centuries, they responded not by loosening bonds, but by doubling down, imposing what historians call the second serfdom. Laws fixed peasants to estates, expanded forced labour days, and curtailed freedom of movement, all to keep grain flowing westward to feed the cities of the Rhine and the Netherlands. Thus the plague, by reshaping demographics, paradoxically widened Europe's social divides. Where once feudal bonds had been relatively uniform across the continent, now a peasant in Norfolk or Picardy might live under very different expectations than one on the Vistula. As the feudal ties loosened, and peasants increasingly found themselves negotiating wages or paying simple rents, something subtle but profound began to stir in Europe's economic life. For centuries, most peasants had lived under a regime of obligation, paying their dues in labour or in kind, cartloads of grain, flocks of chickens, or days spent repairing a lord's road. Cash was sparse in the countryside. Money might pass hand to hand only during annual fairs or for the payment of taxes. But now, with labour scarce and peasants demanding actual wages, silver and copper coins circulated more broadly. Fields were still ploughed, hay still gathered, but more often it was done under contracts that promised pennies or groats, not just fealty. This wage economy had a ripple effect. Even modest peasants found themselves with occasional surplus coin. They spent it on tools crafted by local smiths, on colourful cloth from travelling merchants, on spices or sweetmeats at the village fair. Thus, slowly, local markets brightened. Stalls bustled with more customers. Craftspeople, weavers, coopers, shoemakers found steady demand for their wares. A peasant with coins might even afford a better ploughshare, or a wife might save for a silver clasp to wear on feast days. Europe was becoming, inch by inch, a continent where cash, choice and consumption mattered more. Meanwhile, in the towns and cities that dotted Europe's river valleys and crossroads, the changes ran even deeper. Urban centres were already hubs of craft and trade before the plague, but the influx of people, former peasants seeking opportunity, displaced younger sons of minor nobility, ambitious merchants, accelerated as rural ties weakened. Within these towns, guilds governed the economic life. A guild of bakers set the price of bread. A guild of smiths enforced standards for ploughs and locks. A guild of dyers determined who could colour cloth with precious indigo. In the aftermath of the plague, guildmasters found their services in high demand. With fewer people, skilled artisans could command better fees. Apprentices, once plentiful, were now eagerly courted, promised decent lodging and eventual admission to the mysteries of the trade. This fostered a new kind of prosperity. A successful master mason or goldsmith might dress richly, keep accounts in ledgers, even send a son to university. They became the embryonic middle class, not bound to the soil like peasants, nor tied to knightly service like petty nobles, but living by commerce and craft. And with this prosperity came civic pride. Towns invested in ornate guild halls, elaborate market squares, towering clock towers that not only ordered the hours of work, but stood as symbols of communal ambition. The transformation was not limited to peasants and townsfolk. The nobility too adjusted, often quite shrewdly. Faced with the high cost and frustration of enforcing traditional feudal dues on a scattered, sometimes defiant peasantry, many lords opted to lease out their domains. Rather than directly managing hundreds of acres, they contracted tenants to pay a fixed rent. This reduced their risk and freed them to pursue other ventures. Nowhere was this more dramatically visible than in England, where many landlords began to convert broad fields from grain to pasture for sheep. Wool fetched high prices on the continent, feeding the looms of Flanders and Italy. This was the quiet dawn of the enclosure movement, as communal fields were fenced off to graze flocks. While this increased noble income and tied the English economy ever more deeply into international textile markets, it also began centuries of tension, driving some smallholders off land they once farmed collectively. In this way, the plague unwittingly sowed the first seeds of agrarian capitalism, land as an investment, not merely a hereditary right or duty. Meanwhile, Southward along the winding roads and bustling ports of the Mediterranean, a more overt revolution was underway. In cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa, wealth flowed through counting houses at a scale unimaginable to northern barons or village reeves. The same Black Death that disrupted old markets had also created opportunities, bankrupting rivals, shifting trade balances, and fostering bold new ventures. Italian bankers pioneered instruments that would later underpin global capitalism. They developed bills of exchange that allowed merchants to settle debts across long distances without lugging sacks of coin, and they refined double-entry bookkeeping, making it easier to track profits, losses, and interest. Families like the Medici in Florence, or the Bardi and Peruzzi before them, financed not only merchants but monarchs, underwriting wars and papal elections alike. Ships from Venice sailed to Alexandria and Constantinople, laden with woolen cloth, returning with spices and silks. Their profits were often ploughed into grand palazzi, magnificent churches, or still riskier ventures, more ships, more distant ports. Thus, by the later 14th and early 15th centuries, the first outlines of financial capitalism glimmered across Europe, and in the counting rooms where clerks hunched over ledgers, amid the soft scratch of quills and the clink of gold florins, you could almost hear the future breathing. As the plague years ebbed and flowed, they left more than empty cottages and broken family lines. They etched themselves into the European imagination in ways that would linger for centuries. Everywhere, art began to dwell on mortality. Frescoes on church walls, once bright with saints and golden heavens, now featured grim processions of skeletons leading emperors, bishops, merchants and peasants alike to the grave. This was the Totentanz, the dance of death, a haunting allegory, reminding all that death spares no rank. In Germany and Switzerland, artists painted winding lines of nobles and beggars, hand in hand with skeletal figures. In France, the dance macabre wove through poems and morality plays, the dead forever whispering, "As we are now, so shall you be." Woodcuts and manuscripts multiplied these images. In the flickering candlelight of a village church or a burgomaster's hall, one might pause before such a panel and feel a cold shiver, a memento mori pressed onto the very soul. Graveyard poetry flourished too. Verses on stone or parchment dwelt on worms and rot, the fleeting nature of riches, the sudden cut of the scythe. Even festive songs could turn sombre, interweaving joy with the shadow of the charnel house. Europe had long known death, of course, but the scale and repetition of plague gave it a new, almost obsessive intimacy. This cultural fixation on death also turned people's eyes toward the heavens, and sometimes filled them with questions, or even quiet rage. The medieval church had promised spiritual protection. Its priests blessed processions, sprinkled holy water, and held solemn masses for divine mercy. Yet in plague's cruel tide, the clergy often died alongside their flocks, sometimes fled their posts, or proved helpless to stay God's wrath. This bred a creeping loss of faith in the institution, if not in God outright. Many still flocked to shrines, paid for indulgences, or joined flagellant movements, hoping to avert divine judgment through public penance. But just as many grew suspicious of a clergy that seemed wealthy, worldly, and yet powerless against pestilence. In the later 14th and early 15th centuries, these doubts fermented. Critics like John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia would rail against church corruption, calling for a return to scripture and moral purity. Movements that found fertile ground in hearts already bruised by plague and disillusion. Thus, long before Martin Luther would hammer his theses onto Wittenberg's door, the plague had tilled Europe's soil, sowing seeds of reform with each corpse-laden cart. Even learning changed in plague's aftermath. Medieval universities had been dominated by clerics who taught medicine as a matter of ancient texts, especially the works of Galen, the Greek physician whose humoral theories governed all diagnosis.
Sickness was imbalances of hot and cold, moist and dry. Treatments were bleeding, purging, or poultices crafted by long tradition. But plague confounded these frameworks. Why did it strike one household and spare the next? Why did lancing buboes help some but doom others? Faced with questions that dusty manuscripts could not answer, some scholars began to observe more directly. Physicians in Italy and France started keeping detailed plague journals, recording symptoms day by day. Surgeons, once looked down upon as mere barbers, gained respect for their willingness to lance sores, drain abscesses, and experiment with quarantine. Over time, these cracks in Galen's edifice would widen. Universities slowly admitted more lay students. Anatomy, once largely forbidden, became a serious pursuit. By the early Renaissance, dissections were public spectacles, symbols of a hunger to understand the body, not by rote learning, but by knife and eye. As Europe reeled and slowly transformed, the Black Death also swept across lands destined to become one of the world's mightiest empires. In the mid-14th century, the Ottoman Turks were still a frontier people, rising from their Anatolian heartlands, pressing outward into the fragmented territories left by a waning Byzantine state. They captured towns, negotiated truces, built alliances. Their early armies were lean, mobile, and devout, yet plague did not spare these ambitions. Waves of pestilence repeatedly struck the Ottoman lands. Constantinople itself, before finally falling to Mehmed II in 1453, suffered cyclical outbreaks that drained its populace and weakened its walls' defenders. Ottoman chroniclers recorded grim periods when villages lay hushed, market squares emptied, soldiers fell sick in their tents. Such losses could stall campaigns or erode local economies that fed troops. Still, unlike the shattering demographic blow Europe faced in the initial outbreak, plague's toll here tended to be more episodic, recurring in regional pulses across decades. This forced the Ottomans to become deft managers of crisis, building quarantine stations on caravan routes, regulating ship arrivals, deploying rudimentary health inspections. In time, these measures would become part of the empire's administrative muscle, allowing it to rule a vast, diverse territory under the ever-present spectre of disease. If we turn our lantern eastward to the vastness of Asia, we find an equally profound, though often differently recorded, legacy. It was likely in the Central Asian steppes, among marmots and gerbils, that Yersinia pestis had lurked longest, erupting now and then into local die-offs. Under the Pax Mongolica of the 13th century, trade routes stitched these vast lands together, speeding commerce, ideas, and, tragically, pathogens. By the 1330s and 1340s, Chinese chronicles speak of widespread death. In the final decades of the Yuan dynasty, plague joined famines and rebellions to fatally weaken Mongol rule over China. The grandeur of Kublai Khan's court faded beneath peasant uprisings, failed harvests, and the dread of contagion. When the Ming dynasty rose in 1368, overthrowing the Yuan, they inherited a traumatized, depopulated landscape. Ming policies would emphasize local granaries, strict village registries, and internal controls to stabilize society. In some sense, the plague's indirect work, disrupting Mongol dominance, helped usher in a native Chinese resurgence. Yet plague did not vanish. It flared again in later Ming decades, shaping policy and local fears. Just as in Europe, these outbreaks encouraged bureaucratic record-keeping and debates over medical approaches that slowly chipped away. If we now follow the monsoon winds south and west across the Indian Ocean, we meet a more shadowed history. For here the chroniclers were fewer and oral traditions less concerned with recording precise years of pestilence. Yet hints abound. From East African port cities like Kilwa and Mombasa, tied by dhows to Aden, Hormuz and Calicut, came scattered references to periods when trade faltered, ships lay idle, and local rulers struggled to maintain tribute systems. Merchants in these Swahili coast towns dealt in gold, ivory and slaves, and almost certainly also trafficked unknowingly in fleas and rats. Further inland across the savannas and rainforests, the direct impact of plague is harder to trace. Empires like Mali, which flourished on gold caravans crossing the Sahara, may have felt economic aftershocks if northern ports suffered depopulation, reducing demand for their wares. It is a reminder of how disease can shape history, even where chronicles are silent. If Phoenician and Genoese ships were suddenly fewer on the Red Sea, or if Egyptian buyers were fewer at African markets due to local outbreaks, ripple effects could travel hundreds of leagues, altering the fates of kingdoms that never saw a single European galleon. So here, at the far edge of our 4-hour journey, we stand looking back across a continent transformed. Fields once littered with unburied dead, now green again with new crops, villages rebuilt upon the bones of the old. It seems almost cruel to say that out of so much grief came opportunity. And yet, history is often such a paradox. Because millions perished, the survivors inherited a world abruptly emptied of competitors. Land that once lay beyond reach, tied up in rigid manorial rights, fell idle. Hungry lords, desperate to see their estates worked, offered better terms. Rents dropped. Peasants bargained for wages. Many simply moved on, seeking masters willing to pay coin for their hands. For serfs who might once have been chained by custom to ancestral plots, the plague was a grim liberator. Families who had never tasted meat more than a few times a year might now feast more often. Clothing improved, diets diversified, even houses grew sturdier, with more timber and stone, as the sheer necessity of rebuilding demanded fresh effort and investment. And so, death's long shadow carried within it the strange seed of freedom. Through this shifting landscape, the old feudal order, with its tightly woven web of obligations, tithes and homage, began to fray. No statute or royal edict alone could patch it. Repeated attempts to cap wages or fix people back to the soil largely failed. As the decades turned into centuries, the balance of power tilted. By the 15th century, in many places across England, France, the Low Countries, and parts of Germany, the strict caste lines between lord and peasant blurred. Manorial courts dwindled. Labour dues converted into rents paid in silver. Markets blossomed as surplus grain and wool flowed outward, feeding nascent towns and merchant ventures. Slowly, imperceptibly, the gears of early capitalism began to turn. In this way, the plague had unwittingly performed what no peasant revolt or papal bull could quite achieve on its own. It destabilized a system rooted in birth and station, opening space for contracts, wages, and social mobility. And still, long after the burial pits closed, the Black Death lived on. Not in rats and fleas, but in the stories people told. It haunted paintings, sermons, woodcuts. It filled chronicles and ballads with stark reminders of mortality. Writers from Boccaccio to Chaucer captured the earthy desperation and dark humour that flourished amid catastrophe. Even centuries later, as other plagues revisited Europe, the Italian outbreaks of the 17th century, the Great Plague of London in 1665, old fears flared anew. Officials looked back to medieval quarantines, bills of health, cordons sanitaires. The memory of the Black Death provided both cautionary example and hard-earned blueprint. And, in our modern age, when new diseases circle the globe with unsettling speed, we still reach for metaphors born in that medieval darkness. We speak of plague ships, of quarantine, of contact tracing, legacies shaped in an age of parchment and bells, yet alive in our silicon world. So what is the lesson, in the end? That from under the weight of unimaginable sorrow, humanity proved capable of renewal, Fields lay fallow, villages emptied, families wept at countless graves. Yet across the years, life returned. A new social order struggled up through the cracks, and art, science, and a deeper sense of our common fragility flourished too. It is a story at once tragic and hopeful, reminding us that even in the long nights of history, the human spirit bends but does not break, and that sometimes, from ruin, new worlds are painfully, stubbornly born. Thank you so much for journeying with me through these haunting yet strangely beautiful chapters of our shared past. If this story moved you or sparked some quiet thoughts of your own, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe, like, or share this video with someone who might find it just as calming and educative. Until next story, stay curious, stay kind, and take care.